immediately, it is not going to be distributed to the public immediately. It's being recorded for curation and editing by the group that is going to be speaking today to try to protect people from some of the vulnerabilities and the targeting that happens from conversations like this around especially issues that become unshared and sensitive. So we will be recording, but we will be deciding how to go about distribution later. I'm sorry we could not access a live ASL interpreter today. However, we do have a live transcription feature available if you all would like to access it on your Zoom interface. So with that, I'd like to begin by saying that I want to offer an anti-colonial land statement to welcome us into the space together. I distinguish an anti-colonial land statement from the increasingly common and compulsory ritual of institutional land acknowledgements, which many universities have started adopting. And I do this because I'm committed to cultivating and participating in collective practices, collective communities, and grounded study of liberation, not just acknowledgement, but liberation from oppressive colonial and anti-Black violences, including and especially the forms that enact at the sites of schools, colleges, and universities, including and especially my own place of employment here at University of California, Riverside. So I want to open this occasion by honoring Rupert and Jeanette Costo's legacy of cultivating an indigenous bodily, archival, and epistemological presence at the UC Riverside campus and beyond. The Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples are the original, surviving, and persistent human caretakers of the land, water, and air that is occupied by the University of California. This territory has never been ceded, just as indigenous sovereignty and self-determination have never been surrendered. UCR is inhabited by indigenous, Aboriginal, and First Nations people from all over the world, many of whom are among our faculty, students, and staff. UC Riverside is mere blocks away from the place where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of 19-year-old Taisha Miller in 1998, a reminder that this institution and the University of California generally has a long history of proximity to and active complicity in anti-Black state and state-condoned violence. It's thus with a sense of humble gratitude and urgent obligation that I ask us to confront the conditions that surround and permeate our gathering today. I look forward to continuing the work with many of you that attempts to decolonize this world and to create possibilities for abolitionist, liberated, thriving thought and creativity. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dylan Rodriguez. I welcome you first in my capacity as the co-director of the Center for Ideas in Society with my colleague, Jeanette Cole. I extend a special acknowledgement and thank you to the Center's Executive Director, Catherine Henshaw, and the Center staff that's operating beyond full capacity to make today's roundtable and all our other work happen, in particular, Jessica DiFilippo, our project coordinator, and Kathy Hitchens, the CIS financial analyst. I'm here and also in my 21st year as a faculty member at UC Riverside. I'm the standing past president of the American Studies Association. I'm a proud founding member of Scholars for Social Justice, COPS Off Campus, Critical Ethnic Studies Association, and Critical Resistance. Most importantly, today, I'm proudest to have co-organized this event with my UC Riverside colleague and roundtable co-facilitator, Crystal Beck, who will introduce themselves in a moment, and my dear friend, collaborator, and colleague, S.A. Smythe, whose biography you will also get in just a moment. I'll be honest with everybody in attendance that this roundtable was convened almost entirely through S.A.'s and Crystal's scholarly activist and research affinities and relationships. I'm grateful to them both for making this happen. So I thank all of you who are here live, especially, and who may at some point be watching some version of this recording. I thank you all for your time, your energy, your attention today. The context, I'll give a brief word on the context of this roundtable discussion. The context is obviously overwhelmingly defined by Russia's current massively militarized invasion and attack on Ukrainian sovereignty, right? So not merely the border, not really national borders, but sovereignty. The extraordinary people that we've convened today bring forms of analysis and grounded insight that challenge some of the narratives that are currently circulating and dominating this moment of war and emergency. I will say that I think it is an unavoidable responsibility of scholars, teachers, activists, and organizers to rigorously challenge the humanist, if not Eurocentric universalisms that stubbornly permeate academic and corporate media discourses alike, while shaping and distorting the ways that aid, humanitarianism, diplomacy, and even peace come to be understood in universalized and Eurocentric terms. Our roundtable speakers are generously sharing massive skill sets and expertise with us today. And I especially appreciate the ways that this conversation is an attempt to exemplify a form of collective study that is also study under conditions of different peoples, disparate and often incommensurably different vulnerabilities to the violence of war, occupation, and forced immobilization. I ask that we consider how this crisis of war, militarized violence, and atrocity in Ukraine is constituted and complicated by uncommon and unshared, as well as common and shared suffering in ways specific to the geography and history of the region, as well as in ways that are inseparable from other geographies and histories. So at this point, I'll gratefully pass the mic to my colleague, Crystal Beck. Crystal.
Dylan, thank you so much for that really generous introduction. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. I'm joining you from Tonga Territory, also known as the Greater Los Angeles area. I'm really grateful to be here. So as Dylan shared, I am an associate professor in gender and sexuality studies here at UCR. So before I introduce our incredible panelists here today, I just want to provide some brief notes about Zoom etiquette, which I know all of us are super familiar with already. So throughout our discussion today, please do keep your mics muted. There is a Q&A function here, so if you want to ask a question live, please do so, and Dylan and I will try our best to curate those questions. And then in the last 30 or so minutes, we'll have some time together where the audience, all of you, can engage with our panelists. So with that said, I want to move forward in introducing you to our panelists, and this is in no particular order. So first we have S.A. Smythe, who is joining us from Rome. S.A. is a poet, a translator, an assistant professor of Black European Cultural Studies and Black Trans Poetics at UCLA, where they research relational aspects of Black belonging and beyond borders. They are also a senior fellow at the Center for Applied Transgender Studies. S.A. Smythe is the editor of Troubling the Grounds, Global Configurations of Blackness, Nativism, and Indigeneity, special issue for Postmodern Culture, and the forthcoming book, Where Blackness Meets a Sea, on Crisis, Culture, and the Black Mediterranean. S.A. organizes with students and other comrades in the broader COPSUF Campus Coalition and other abolitionist, anti-carceral, refugee, and migrant support groups across Turtle Island and in Europe. Winner of the 2022 Rome Prize, S.A. is currently based between Rome and Tonga land. So next we have Kenan Amini, who is the chairperson of the Roma Center and the founder and director since 2015 of the Roma Anti-Discrimination Network. He is also vice chair of the Bunds Roma Verband, an umbrella organization of migrant Roma in Germany. Amini works on the situation of deported Roma, among others, in Serbia, Kosovo, Macedonia, and Roma also threatened with deportation Germany and the rise of the far right in Europe. He is the director of the documentary film, The Awakening, about the situation of deported young Roma in various countries. We also have Harsha Walia, who is the author of Border and Rule, Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism, published by Haymarket in 2021, and also Undoing Border Imperialism, AK Press 2013. Based in unceded Coast Salish territories, also known as Vancouver, Canada, Harsha has been involved in community-based, radical grassroots migrant justice, abolitionist, feminist, anti-imperialist, and anti-capitalist movements for the past 2 decades, including the No One is Illegal movement. Next, we have Chelsea West O'Huary, who is from Jackson, Missouri. She is an assistant professor of Slavic and Eurasian studies at the University of Texas, Austin, with appointments in anthropology, Black studies, and population health. She is currently a Weatherhead Fellow at the School for Advanced Research. Her scholarship focuses on racialization and belonging in Albania and the Balkan region. Her ethnographic book project explores the meanings and the makings of race, as well as the significance for Albanians, the Roma, and also Egyptians in Tirana, Albania. West O'Huary has published on the subjects of racial belonging, configurations of Blackness and whiteness in the Balkans, the bodily health impacts of racism and marginalization in Eastern Europe broadly. Next, we have Sunny Rucker-Chain, who is Associate Professor of Slavic and East European Studies and is also affiliate faculty in Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies, Film and Media Studies, and the Nathaniel R. Jones Center for Race, Gender and Social Justice at the University of Cincinnati. She's also director of the University of Cincinnati's Star Talk Workforce Development, Media and Year-Round Student Immersion Program, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Lead for the Institute for Research in Sensing, and also the co-director of the Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies undergraduate think tank, which is housed at Howard University. She's also the author of Roma Rights and Civil Rights, a Transatlantic Comparison, which came out with Cambridge in 2020, and also the co-editor of and contributor to Chinese Migrants in Russia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe, out with Routledge in 2011. Next, we have Vanessa E. Thompson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Gender Studies at Queen's University. Her scholarship and teaching focuses on Black studies and anti-colonialism, abolition, critical racism, and migration studies, and activist ethnographies. She's published widely on Blackness and Black movements in France and Europe more broadly, as well as being involved with Black abolition struggles and world making. Vanessa is a member of the International Independent Commission on the Death of Ori Jalloh and organizes with abolitionist feminist collectives in Europe and globally. And today, Vanessa will also be translating for Kenan. So a special appreciation for you, Vanessa. And finally, we have Susie Kim, who is a historian and teaches at Rutgers State University of New Jersey. Susie is the author of Everyday Life in the North Korean Revolution, published by Cornell University Press. And she also has a book coming out this year with Cornell, Among Women Across Worlds, North Korea and the Global Gold War. She's a founding member of Women Across DMZ, a global movement of women to end in the Korean War. So an amazing group of panelists. We're just so grateful that you're here. So I will pass it on to Dylan for the first question.
Thank you. And folks, just so you have a sense of our sense of organization here, we're going to facilitate this discussion for about the next hour, 15 minutes. And then we're going to open up the last half hour or so for question and answer from the folks that are in attendance. So please feel free to use the Q&A. Crystal and I will curate that as best we can. Apologies in advance that we will certainly not get to anything but a fraction of the questions that get raised. So the first question I will direct at Kenan, and with thanks to Vanessa for any assistance with interpretation and translation. So our first question flows like this. Kenan, can you outline for us the on-the-ground work that you are currently doing in the area of the invasion of the war? And please, can you offer us some description of the particular forms of emergency and suffering that it seems many mainstream and corporate media outlets and even academics may be ignoring, marginalizing, or otherwise missing?
Okay, hello everybody. I will just start with the beginning about our work, just for the audience to understand. I don't know if everybody know who the Roma is. But in Europe, it's Roma are a large number, something like maybe 20 million now, officials. We have some other number, but yes, it's a minority, but it's around the Europe. So I also, from ex-Yugoslavia, I just arrived in Germany in 1999 when NATO bombing ex-Yugoslavia for 78 days. So this kind of experience, we have also Roma from ex-Yugoslavia, but today we see the similarity what's happening now in Ukraine. Because in time of war in Yugoslavia, Roma fled or was expelled more than 150,000. And sadly, nobody speak about it, and very few know about this exodus, let's say, because Roma lived there for 600 years. But today they live in everywhere in Europe, but also with some bad status, or they will be deported or not, and stuff like this. And this is the issue where we work about also anti-Gypsyism, but also racism, anti-discrimination about Roma. So to get to the point, to Ukraine, we work also before the war, also with Post-European country, and also make monitoring to see how Roma live in these countries. So what's happening now in Ukraine is similar what we have this in Yugoslavia and Kosovo. That Roma people from Ukraine, I mean, you get the information about the Ukrainians, majority, they are now more than 2 million in neighbor countries like Slovakia, Poland, and Czechia, also Moldavia and Hungary. But they are also welcoming this neighbor country, also Germany. It's a lot of support. You see also here in Germany, it's a big support from every side. Even if they arrive here after 90 days, maybe they're gonna get also paper legally to work here and to live for 3 years. So the support is very big, and I'm glad there's something happening in this way. But from other perspective of Roma, it's something what majority don't know. So we have some situation that Roma can even not flee Ukraine, because they will not let from Ukrainians in the borders. Because we must also see the history a little bit, why Roma people in Ukraine, they don't have papers. More than 20% of them, they don't have a passport or some documents, because of stigmatization and also segregation, how these people live for years in very bad style of living. And around them also racism and discrimination, and also with right-wing neo-Nazis, they was always conform. So what we have now, the situation is that a lot of Roma people stuck in Lviv. Lviv is also something like 100 kilometers from the border of Slovakia. So, they cannot live without papers, but who have the papers also cannot live, because the solidarity people, like voluntary buses, what they work, they go through from Slovakia to Ukraine to collect the people. So they choose, they take first the, sorry I say, but white Ukrainians. And then it's no place for Roma to go in these buses. So this is one big problem for us, because the people are in some bad situation. They don't have food, they don't have money, they don't have nothing. And also it's no resource now in Ukraine, so they stuck somehow. But we have some Roma organization, they are still there, and somehow try to help them. And we try from Western Europe also to support somehow, and to bring some stuff and to pick up some people. So, but this is very small. This is in very small number how we can help. We try to bring some family. We bring one in Leipzig, and some buses come also to Erfurt, some other city, but also in Hamburg. But this is really small number compared to this 2 million what we already have in these neighbor countries around Ukraine. And and then we have contact with the people also in Slovakia, Poland, and Czechia. They have still problem when they cross the border. So they will not get the support from Slovakia people like for Ukrainian what they do. So even if they go in this big hall where everybody like collect them, they're gonna be separated or bring them in another place, maybe 20 or 30 kilometers in some other place where it's no structure, no nothing. So we have some contact with some church, one priest. he collect something like 150 people in this church, and he tried to support them. And we have something like 300 people. They cross also. They go to Western Europe through this church. But this is something what somebody do voluntary, you know, like because they are also Christian. Orthodox Christian, and this church is also minority because these countries are also Catholic. So this church take them somehow in safety. So and then we have only land, the neighbor land from Ukraine is Moldova or Moldova. I don't know English is correct or not. So this is the only place where Roma can come from Ukraine to Moldova without papers. But Moldova is not in EU, or she's not in the part of the EU country. So they're gonna stuck there. So we have some big number of people, they go there just for safety. But we are not happy for behavior, how the politic and how these supporters on this voluntary buses. I'm gonna say just one example. Some voluntary buses, they took some family and also some firemen.
Firefighters. Feuerwache,
Yes.
meinst du?
Yeah.
So
He just gave some statement. He said, no, we cannot help these people because they're gonna use now this situation to have some better life, you know, just to come in some better situation. So we have Ukrainian people, sorry, but they come with the dogs, with the cats, and for everybody some place. But some Roma families come, they stigmatize them and they say, no, you want to use this situation just to go in some rich country or to do something, or I don't know. So this is the situation what we have now, but this is the same situation what we have 1991 also for NATO bombarding. Nobody speak about Roma. We know Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, but nobody speak about them. And a lot of them die and stuff like this. And we have this situation also now. So what we do now correctly is organize ourselves. So we have one big network in Germany. And we have also people, they just arrive with the cars, small cars to pick 3 or 4 people. But this is also a problem. When they arrive there, then you have some family, but maybe you know, but Roma family, if you meet one, then they are something like 5, 6, or maybe 10. So they don't want to separate themselves. So that was also the problem, how to bring this family. So it was also some buses, but very, very small, and also no financial somehow, you know, it's no structure, it's just voluntary, collecting some money and collecting some good people to drive through Poland or to Slovakia to bring them. What we try now is this in next week to bring some family from this church, what we say, because they must also make place for other people. They're gonna arrive in this place because this church is also small. So it's very small dimension how people get help in this big picture what we have, this global picture what we have, and how you see how many supporting we have for this Ukrainian, let's say, refugees. But it's segregation, and this is not only for Roma; it's also for from Black students and Indians and from Asia. They are in similar situation. I don't know. We also posted one video. It was one mixed group where the people from the train, they didn't let them to go inside, and they beg, they say, please let us inside, you know. So they want to make place first for their people, you know, like American first, I don't know, some kind of trip like this, you know, the Ukrainian first, and then, but also after they don't have place. So we have a lot of reports of not only Roma, a lot of others, but our problem is that these Roma people, most of them don't have a paper. So So they're gonna stuck in Ukraine, and we are now in this moment to see how to bring them in safety, because we don't know how long this is gonna go like this. So this is short. I don't know how much time I took.
Oh, thank you, Kenan. We can come back to you in a minute, but that's thank you for the generous description. And I know you all of us acknowledge that you're on the ground dealing with this. So we appreciate the analysis and the thick description of all this. This is very illuminating for everybody. Very, very, very good, very dense. Vanessa, you wanted to follow up.
Yes, thank you. I'm speaking from Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territories, just because usually I'm based in Europe, actually. And I really see these struggles as very, very connected. Thank you also, Kenan, for giving us this report. I think it's crucial because we really see how Roma people are constantly erased in these kind of discourses. And even if we ask, like, you know, are Ukrainian speaking, a lot of Roma people are actually are erased even from the realm of speaking. So that's why it's so important to have Roma people here on this panel, and Kenan on this panel, who actually is in contact with Roma on the ground, who are made unable to speak on this situation. I just wanted to maybe add to something that Kenan just said in relation to what is going on in terms of the Black communities and South Asian folks, also some of the Iranian students. So I think some have seen the international media coverage, at least some of it, that people were pushed out of buses, thrown out of buses, thrown out of trains when they were trying to go at the borders, to the borders out of Ukraine, so fleeing from Ukraine, but then were also, of course, brutalized and punished by police. We have several reports from Polish police. This is, of course, no surprise that this is the function of policing, right? But I think it's also important to think that what we see is really the kind of policing and border racism that is going on by these institutions, but also the societal dimensions. So when they're then pushed out from trains, it's like the society that is doing that in a way, and it doesn't stop in Ukraine. They experience similar things in Poland. I just talked to comrades there yesterday. Even in Germany, the police at Frankfurt-Oder, at Kassel, and what have you, are separating the people that they're taking the passports from Black folks, from brown folks, if they even have passports, and are detaining them. And at the same time, we see massive rollouts in terms of Eurocentric solidarity, right? It's for the first time that the EU is actually doing a massive rollout program for visas, humanitarian visas, that people can work there and get a work permit and everything. So everyone who has been working on migrant justice issues know that we have been calling for this and working for this since actually decades, and now it can happen within a night. You see people mobilizing civil society massively. I think this is much more already than we have seen in 2015. You see hotels letting people sleep in the hotel rooms. We see trains, Deutsche Bahn, TGV in France, driving to the Polish border to pick people up for free. But of course, what they mean is Ukrainian nationals red as white. And I think this is really, it just shows us, it's like zooming in to everything that is wrong with militarism, war, policing, and borders and racial capitalism, and why it has to be abolished. This is obviously nothing new, but I think it's really, it shows actually how emergent this really is. It's one side that really shows the emergency. And I think we can talk further about what this means in terms of military expansion, Germany being at the forefront of it, and what we're actually coming up against.
Go ahead, Essay.
Yeah, I mean, everything that Kenan is saying, everything is always that Vanessa is saying. I wanted to add, I'm currently in Rome, Italy, I just really wanted to underscore a point that Vanessa has actually already touched, which is that those of us and others who remain on the ground have been doing this kind of work for generations even. And I did just maybe want to amplify, especially because we're having a conversation, but it's a public one, to maybe just throw in something that we can think together about how to sort of dispense with, as people in good faith who are interested in collective liberation and so on, the kind of consistent whataboutism and switching of roles that is happening, calls of hypocrisy that actually don't do anything to further our collective liberation, because it's not a facile thing to say that those of us who've been doing the work have been doing it for generations, that we've been here before, that the emergency is not a new emergence, but rather a retrenched capitulation to already existing border regimes, racial capitalism, and so on. I'm super excited that Harsha is here because from her book and organizing and other things, we know that the border is the crisis, right? And so that's actually why I'm really excited to be here, independent of national configurations, because nationalism is also the problem, right? And I'm saying this as a person with attachments, colonial and otherwise, to Britain, formerly in the European Union, where we see that there are Ukrainian migrants, Ukrainian refugees, and we can also talk a bit about the disarticulation and the conflation of those two distinct categories, who are able to go to European Union flights without visas, but then you have at Luton or Stansted or Manchester, no Ukrainians on those planes because they still need a visa even in this time of emergency. So actually then we know, as Vanessa is saying, that things can turn on a dime and doors can be opened and borders can fall and be rendered porous. But then when you're committed to other iterations, not that those are not part of the project, other iterations of a white supremacist project like Britain, like the United Kingdom, and its colonial iterations therein, those borders can actually get further ossified, right? Ukrainian refugees, as well as all kinds of other people, still need visas. And so the state of emergency or the state of emergence is one of a rearing its head of white supremacy, where crisis or turning points, which is what crisis means etymologically, is actually not the condition for reflection of the actual crisis at hand, which again is to say the border.
Essay, thank you so much for those critical observations, and also Vanessa and Kenan. I just want to shift into the second question, and it actually overlaps with what all of you have already been sharing. So let me just read the question out loud, and for panelists, please respond in any way that that resonates with you. So I'm wondering, and this is also for our audience who are wanting a more critical analysis of understanding what is happening in Ukraine within sort of larger histories that all of you have spoken so eloquently to. So, of course, while the situation is devastating in Ukraine, there are ways in which the North American Western media is describing this as a worst humanitarian crisis to hit Europe. And I'm just wondering if all of you can share from your specific positionalities why it's so important to actually complicate this narrative. And maybe if it's okay, I want to start with Chelsea, and also apologize to Chelsea for, I want to amend what I said earlier. So Chelsea is actually from Jackson, Mississippi, not Missouri. So I just want to apologize for that mishap. So go ahead, Chelsea.
Thank you, Crystal. Yes, Jackson, Mississippi. Yes, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for being here today, for joining us. Very grateful for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. And I'm coming to you today from Santa Fe, New Mexico, but yes, originally from Jackson, Mississippi. And so in kind of building on a couple things, the comments that SA made, but also in response to the question. So as someone who does work in Albania and Kosovo and throughout the Balkans, one thing I pay particular attention to is the ways that this particular crisis is framed in terms of the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II in Europe, as though we don't have anything to talk about from 1990 until 1999 when it comes to the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. And so just that erasure of what happened in the Balkan region and over almost a decade, and particularly the ways that it really shaped displacement and thinking about very various particular racial, gender, national violences, religious violence as well. It's really telling how this crisis is talked about in popular discourse. And so that's one thing I wanted to raise. And the other is in thinking about borders and thinking both about the geopolitical borders, but also embodied borders, as Kenan brought up and others have already spoken to, the ways that groups like Roma, like those like Black folks, those of African descent throughout Europe, and particularly thinking about Eastern Europe, really are viewed as not embodying a certain type of national belonging, right? And so even thinking within the geopolitical borders of nation states in this present moment, the ways that there are everyday forms of racialization that render people outside of the nation, and particularly thinking about the experiences of Roma in the Balkan region and in Eastern Europe broadly, and how that plays out.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. I also want to open this up to our other panelists who might want to respond to this question.
I think I saw Susie and Sunny.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to say how honored I am to be part of this panel, and I feel a little bit or maybe a lot humbled. I don't know if there's that much I can contribute, but I was thinking about the questions that the moderators posed in preparation for the panel today. And I thought something that maybe I can bring as a historian, and a historian of Asia in particular, is the fact that when the media keeps spinning this whole crisis as something that's unprecedented since World War II, there are at least two things in my mind that is being erased in that process. And coincidentally, both of these instances were something that in my classes that we were recently discussing, because it just happened to coincide with this event. But we were talking about World War II in the context of East Asia, and how the timeline for that would be very different. So in other words, I was asking my students to compare World War II and the way that they've been taught about that with the way that they've been taught about the Asia-Pacific War, if that even came up at all. And I was pointing out that imperialism in East Asia happened much earlier, and there was aggression by the expansion or the imperial ambitions of the Japanese Empire. And there was no call for basically, respecting sovereignty in that case. So oftentimes World War II is dated to 1937 with the expansion of Germany and the way that Germany as a state invaded other countries. But when Japan basically encroached upon, whether it's mainland China or other places, that basically got sidelined. And so what we're talking about in class was basically that in some ways you can extend the crisis at that point in the early 20th century to potentially the turn of the century, so that the first Sino-Japanese War in 1895, basically, which led to the annexation of Taiwan by Japan as its first colony, you could extend the crisis to a much earlier period. And in fact, you saw the colonization of Korea by Japan in 1905, when the Russo-Japanese War ended with the Japanese victory in that case. And so, just wanted to point out that if we're talking about aggression and being wary of imperial expansion, then I think there's kind of a disconnect in the way that we call out one form of aggression as opposed to others. And then the other point that I wanted to make is that if we want to take the current crisis in Ukraine as being unprecedented since World War II, we're basically completely erasing the entire history of the Cold War. And as a historian who's been studying the Cold War, the label, the Cold War itself, is very misleading, because it definitely wasn't cold for basically any part of the world outside of Europe. And in fact, what I really find it important to emphasize to my students oftentimes is the fact that outside of next to the two world wars, with casualty rates into the millions, it was actually the Korean War and the Vietnam War that had extremely heavy casualty rates, from 3 to 5 million people, upwards of 70% who were civilians. And that happened during the so-called Cold War, where presumably there was no confrontation. But the massive amounts of casualties that completely get sidelined as a result of basically painting this conflict as being unprecedented since World War II, I think bears being that we all should be reminded about.
Thank you so much, Susie, for that contextualization. And Sunny, I also want to give you some space to share.
Yeah, so thank you so much for assembling this panel. To those of you who organized it, I know I've been corresponding primarily with Dylan, but thank you. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you, Chelsea, so much for bringing up the wars of the 1990s. As someone who is also a scholar of the Balkans, but primarily former Yugoslavia, I find it really telling that that whole entire period of the 90s it has been somehow taken out of European history. It's as if we forgot, and our memories are very, very short. Thank you, Keenan, for talking about Romani displacement during that war, but also in acknowledging that there's also the acknowledgement that we should be having a conversation about Romani displacement in general in post-socialist times, right? So you had so much Romani movement from out of Eastern Europe, particularly Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, that happened. So if we think about it as we think about humanitarian crises, I think as these very concentrated points in history, but this has been an unfolding humanitarian crisis for Romani people for decades at this point. I would also like to say, in terms of our conversation of borders, if we look at the period of 2015, right, it hasn't even been that long since we had this so-called refugee crisis that was coming through the Balkan corridor, as it were. So our histories, our memories are very short, they're very contextualized, but they're taken out of a context. And I think as someone who is representing Slavic and East European studies, I see this as an opportunity for us to connect these crises and think about what our field can be saying more broadly about what is happening in Ukraine, what has happened in Georgia, what has happened in Azerbaijan and Armenia, as well as what has happened in Donbass and Luhansk over all of this time period, and look at it more broadly and thinking about what lessons haven't we learned from a period of post-socialism? What lessons haven't we learned about migration, particularly for minoritized groups or minority groups or groups that have been excluded from the nation? And Chelsea talked about the embodiment of the nation. What does it mean to embody the nation? What does it mean to be European? And how might we reconceive the way that we think of who gets to be Ukrainian by way of this crisis? Part of the reason why we have to have this conversation at all is because of the way that we have been able to talk about Ukraine, or the way that we've been able to talk about European, but then everybody else has to have a hyphenated identity or an asterisk by their name. So being European otherwise. And I'm hoping that if anything that comes from this conversation at the end, the one very large takeaway is that we need to complicate what we mean when we call people by a particular nationality or a particular group, right? And that's something that I hope we will all get a chance to do after this, not just us on this panel, because we're already doing that.
Trisha, I wanted to pass it to you as well.
Thank you so much. And let me just reiterate what an honor it is to be here with all of you. Thank you all for your time and for organizing. And Kenan, thank you so much for joining us in the midst of everything that's happening. Just solidarity and respect to you, especially during this time. I'm on the unceded Coast Salish territories, lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, who still exercise their laws and their jurisdiction on these lands. And, you know, I also offer this not simply as a land acknowledgement, but really to see these continuities. And, you know, right now there's struggles, many land struggles, particularly against pipelines that land defenders have been blockading on these territories. Canada is a resource extractive economy, a really resource intensive economy. And one of the many ways in which, you know, this war boomerangs back onto land defenders in the context of fossil fuel extraction is very real, right? So just also thinking about the global implications of what Europe even means, and you know who not only who gets included in our ideas of Europe, but how global entanglements of violence means that Europe exists everywhere, right? It literally is the birthplace of enslavement, of empire, of indentureship, and so much more. I just wanted to maybe echo some points on this and maybe offer some more. And briefly, just again, what we hear or what I hear about when the invocation of the worst humanitarian crisis to hit Europe since World War II is, of course, 1991, and for decades after that, right, the Balkan Wars. And the immensity of that has already been said. So, I want to emphasize how important that is, because that involved genocide, right? We can't forget about genocide against particularly Bosnian Muslims and so many others, and it spanned decades, and again continues and echoes and reverberates in so many ways. But I also think there's a specific continuity here and similarity, maybe similarity more so than continuity, which is that even in considering Putin's justifications and his ideology, right, his commitment to reviving the kind of greater Russia, his ideological authoritarian underpinnings are so similar to the greater Serbia irredentist right-wing movement of the 1990s, right? So we see that synergy and that rise of far-right nationalist populism continuing. And that is so crucial because, as people have said, it's not just about rejecting militarism, but how militarism is so deeply structured through right-wing populism and nationalism. And also how that echoes elsewhere, right? The white supremacist Christchurch shooter, who many of us will, perhaps know that history or that violence more clearly or intimately based on where we live. He glorified the Bosnian Serbs' army's ethnic cleansing of Bosnian Muslims, right? So again, these transnational continuities of violence is so necessary. And so it's a vital lens, I think, when we consider not only the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but really we also consider the growing far-right movements that really include, but also exceed the kind of realpolitik Cold War orientations, right, that we're kind of forced into. The second that has been mentioned is, what gets classified as crisis to hit Europe, who's included in the crisis of Europe, the crisis of citizenship, of migration, of displacement that has been going on for decades, but really in the media sphere since 2015, the crisis of millions of people literally being rendered stateless. And also, what the Schengen zone has done, right? The Schengen zone, which professedly has opened up European borders, but we know that has meant immense unsafety for Roma, who can no longer claim refuge within the bounds of the EU. And then, of course, many who are not considered European citizens, right? Middle Eastern, African, from the Sahel region, so many people who are rendered displaced within Europe. The third thing I wanted to mention, and this might be familiar to those of us on the panel, but I just want to emphasize this for all of us, is it's impossible to separate this from the deeply racist and orientalizing media narratives that we've heard, right? Of like, quote unquote, look, they seem so much like us, where again, Ukrainian is read as white, and who that leaves out and who that reinscribes, even if conditionally, even if contingent, even in this moment. And literally statements, we're talking about Europeans leaving in cars that look like ours to save their lives. So, these kinds of depictions in the mainstream media that not only reinscribe whiteness, but also normalizes violence and war and imperialism for the majority of the world, right? And again, I say that, as Essie pointed out, not in a kind of whataboutism way, but in a very real way, right? That there is global violence that is impacting people. We're talking about Haiti, we're talking about Somalia, we're talking about Yemen, we're talking about Afghanistan, we're talking about people whose lives, people in Syria, that this is very necessary to include in our conversations about crisis, right? What and how is crisis made? Who is affected by this crisis? How are we implicated in this crisis? To both point out, not in a campist way, but that pointing out the many forces of imperialism is how we are anti-war, right? That is actually the ethical position to stake out. And I think the last thing that I'd offer is, again, this fixation on what happens in Europe. And sometimes as leftists, it can become easy to refuse Europe, right? The stance can become to refuse Europe. But I think that can often ignore how the war boomerangs. We've seen that some of the countries that are going to be affected by the agricultural crisis now that is also looming are the 5 countries that are most likely to be impacted by the looming grains crisis we've learned are Egypt, Yemen, Ethiopia, Lebanon, and Palestine. So to say that we care about what is happening in Ukraine is to say we care about what is going to happen in Egypt, in Yemen, in Ethiopia, in Lebanon, in Palestine, and elsewhere, because this war will boomerang. Again, it'll boomerang on land defenders. And I want to end with the words of the Zapatistas who offered a statement in solidarity with Ukraine and the struggle, with the people of Ukraine, right? Not against this revanchist, the kind of rise in nationalisms, but against militarism. And they said, and I'll quote, "Those who win in this war are the big weapon manufacturing consortiums and the big capitals that see this opportunity to conquer, to destroy, reconstruct territories. That is to say, to create new markets of commodities and consumers and also of human life." And so I want to end with that because I think, that really disentangles what we mean if we think about this crisis through an internationalist lens that really rejects, as everyone has said already, not only the invasion and that rejects militarism, but also forces us to rethink and really think about this moment as one of world making, right? In this project of liberation.
I want to express my gratitude to the Roundtable so far for just completely productively and creatively disarticulating the dominant narratives that so many of my friends, colleagues, and loved ones have been inundated and saturated with over the last 2 weeks. I mean, the work that you all are doing just in these moments is so invaluable that I really hope that the folks that are in attendance, and perhaps if we can curate this recording and put it out to people, I hope that the pedagogical intervention and political, practical intervention that you all are making is really felt by people the way I'm feeling it right now. I feel like I'm your student right now and I'm in seminar. So I just want to express that as we move into this. Thank you all so far. Let me move into one of our other discussion questions. And I'm going to direct this to Chelsea and then to Kenan, and then other roundtablists, please chime in as you go. But the question has to do with really just asking you all to draw on the skill set and the expertise that I alluded to in my kind of opening comments. Can you help us further understand what is happening along the Ukraine-Russian border and maybe beyond, regarding what some of you all have already raised, which is the consolidation of far-right or ultra-right reactionary nationalism, fascist rule, different forms of Eurocentrism and white supremacy, and maybe even the other dimension of this, folks have talked about as racial capitalism in a global scale situated in this site, which is this wild asymmetrical accumulation of wealth, capacity, resources across the region, meaning Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So again, I'll start with Chelsea and then Kenan, I'll ask you to go after Chelsea, and then other folks, please chime in. Just let me know.
Thank you for that question. And so I was actually taking a lot of notes, took some notes with what Harsha was saying. And so I'll try to answer parts of it, but then I know we'll continue dialogue with the other panelists. So a couple things, I actually teach a course called On White Nationalism, and thinking about it in a very comparative global context, because so often when we hear terms, especially in the American US audience, around white nationalism, it's thought to be something that is unique to the US or to the West, and understood in very vague ways. And so I also wanted to just kind of give a framework of a global understanding of white, the category term white and whiteness, but then also talk about whiteness and race itself as always in process. So these are not fixed terms. And for many people who are very familiar with Ukraine, maybe of the region, I've heard a lot of articulations lately around the ways that Ukrainians have been racialized as not quite white, on the margins of a white Europeanness. And so I want to call attention to that, but also the ways that Ukrainians and others from Eastern Europe are racialized as white, especially in relation to groups like Roma, and to Black folks broadly, right? And so I want to also give an understanding about that. And we think about white nationalism in transnational context. Harsha very rightly so brought up the Christchurch shooter, and in his manifesto, which was a white nationalist manifesto, multiple pages long, 50+ pages, not only did he make references to the former Yugoslavia, but he actually played war songs, right? So for example, Serbian nationalist anthems during the actual shooting, right? And so that's just one way too of making these kind of transnational connections when it comes to white white nationalism. And then one of the ways that ultra nationalism and white nationalism has emerged in this particular conversation is the ways that, Putin has said that part of the motivation is to address neo-Nazism in Ukraine. And that framing itself is not a very good one, but what Putin is doing is both not acknowledging the high numbers of white nationalists in Russia, right, and thinking about the influence of people like Alexander Dugin, and the ways that Moscow is even shaped by like the imperialist movement in Russia. So both this conversation is silenced and not brought up, but also, yes, there are connections, like transnational white nationalist connections, and Ukraine is a part of that. And parts of Ukraine have been sites for white nationalist training and white nationalist militia groups. And so I want to also bring that conversation there because it's complex, is what I'm trying to say. There are a lot of complexities there, but at the same time, recognizing that this narrative that is being driven by Russia, as though this is an attack on neo-Nazism or attack on fascist ultra-nationalism, is one that is to the advantage of Russia. And so I wanted to also just kind of, again, to really complicate our discussion and understanding, but also remembering that this is very transnational. This is not limited to any one particular region.
Yeah, I really appreciate your kind of rigorous opening up of this discussion, Chelsea, because even among folks who I think intend well, there still is this dependence on very simplistic narratives around the presence of far-right and reactionary elements in and around that region, but also beyond it in a very ahistorical narrative. So I think this kind of complexity is really something that has to be front and center. It can't just be a kind of corollary discussion. It actually needs to be central if people are actually interested in things like justice, peace, and survival at this point. Kenan, can I ask you to respond to the same question about what's happening along the border of Ukraine and Russia and ultra-right nationalism and so forth?
Okay, I would like just to remind all of us the Second World War and the Nazi to arrive till Stalingrad in Russia. In the time of Second World War, they must cross through the Ukraine, yes. So the Ukrainian, they have also history that they was also supporters of Nazis in the Second World War. It's a very known history for us in Europe. We know that they was proud and collaborate also with the fascist Nazi. So Nazi can also arrive to Stalingrad in Russia, where the Red Army fight with them. So I just want to say this because it's very important. This is something what we have in the history, but after the Second World War and the Red Army win and come to Germany, so we have the big Russian, yes, but after the war, 1989, also the Ukraine was like a state like Ukraine. She was not more the part of Russia. So this is the beginning also for the nationalists, on the neo-Nazis, on all of these organizations. They start to build themselves. So we have something like so many years that they also even have the finger in the politics. So let's say like this Azov Balaton organization is also supporting from the politician. This is also what Orban also support the Black Garda in Hungary. You know, you have some paramilitary neo-Nazis. They just go to you know, they make they call themselves that they clean the town. Yes, if Roma people come in the Kiev, yes, we have 2018. I don't know if you know, but C14 group also part of this Azov. So they attack also Roma. They just let some numbers, telephone for Ukrainians. If you have some problem, just call us. If you see Roma, we're gonna clean the town. So they go and they also burn the places where Roma live and even murder some young Roma, 22 years, with a knife in his heart, you know, in time where he's sleeping, and also stuff like this. But this is everything what the state also support, and they have a program also the new stuff after Russia separate from Ukraine, so they bring also new national pride. So we have for 30 years something like it's happening, but not only in Ukraine, we have it also in Yugoslavia. Also, don't forget the war. I mean, the Nazis, the fascists were in time from Second World War. They didn't kill people in Croatia in Jasenovac. It was also Ustasha, you know, the Croatian collaborator. Also in Serbia, we have Chetniks. They also collaborate with the Nazis, but we have also Albanian like Skenderbeg, also in Kosovo. So we have a big history of this fascist ideology, what Hitler bring for the people, you know, like to support their nationality and stuff like this. So this is not something to take like this. When Putin say to end with Nazification, so this is not only propaganda. Okay, we can do now what we want, you know, but this is all story. We know this, it's happening, and it's true, it's happening. So what you have in Ukraine is also the Klitschko brothers. Also, they cooperate with this Nazi organization. You can see them in photos, in events, in everywhere. So they also will celebrate figures around. So and we have this problem not only in Ukraine, we have in Europe. You know, if you see the European Parliament, now we have, I think, 12 parties in European Parliament. So it's bad. I don't think it's good future for the Europe. And this is maybe one bullet now what's happening, but I don't think we're going to stop, because we have a lot of German people. They want to also go to fight in Ukraine. We have a lot of other people. They want to go also to fight for Ukraine. So, but this group are also known like extremists. So.
Thank you for that. I have Vanessa and then Harsha are also going to contribute to this question.
Thank you, Kenan. And I really want to acknowledge that I really, very much appreciate this kind of global and also transnational dimension in terms of how we are speaking of what is going on in Ukraine and how this is really connected. And I just wanted to maybe throw in also in relation to what you said, Harsha, in terms of the boomerang, because I think Césaire can really help us here. In terms of the relation between racial capitalism and fascism, right? So that it's not some kind of, I don't know, right outside of something, but that. And it's very important because we see currently, I don't know, even in Germany, that has been an issue, but I saw it here also in so-called Canada around the convoys and what have you, that there was a kind of surprise that police felt, right, not really engaging with these kind of right-wing forces, or people talked about infiltration. Well, it's not an infiltration, because the alliance between institutionalized fascism and neo-fascism and these kind of right-wing paramilitary groups is part of how racial capitalism operates. And I think that's very crucial when we think about, for instance, of course, the relation between fascism and colonialism, what we learned particularly through Césaire, but also can see that this, on the one hand, this war will boomerang, but it's also the result of a boomerang. And I think that's closely when we think of a lot of these wars were taken place inside Europe, but particularly also outside Europe. I mean, we mentioned already, right? Yemen, Iraq, Somalia, Ethiopia. So we have to connect this all also in terms of the question of militarism. And maybe that's because this kind of binary thing, like, you know, the kind of binary cold, which Susie, you said, is never just a cold war. It's actually hot for a lot of people. On this globe, particularly the racialized poor, that people have to, and people have been countering this binary. I think we need a multi-directional analysis and critique of how imperialisms operate and how colonialisms operate, right? And at the same time, how they are entangled, because it cannot be that the alternative is now, and I mean, obviously this is not a surprise, but that we see liberals even calling for NATO to bomb again, that we see a so-called peace movement that is running around with flags, right? I mean, what's that for a kind of peace movement? And I think that's really important because people are now calling a lot of folks for the militarization of Ukraine and to give them weapons. And I think that's very important because the expansion of militarism we're currently seeing, I mean, the German Bundestag announced a week ago that it's going to commit to 100 billion euros in defense spending. This will catapult Germany to the third largest militarized power after the US and China, right? So what we're currently seeing even within Europe, and others will follow, don't get this twisted. And so the weapons are going to Ukraine, a lot in the hands of these neo-Nazi structures. And at the same time, institutionalized fascism is expanding when we see the massive militarization that is going on. So we can see here that the German defense budget, for instance, in 2022 will be 83.5 billion. That's a 45% increase in relation to 2021, right? So that's more or less the estimation. And people who are a bit like firm with what's going on in Western Europe, but also parts of Eastern Europe around this question, know that there's one so-called scandal after the other of right-wing networks operating within police and within the Bundeswehr, the German army. And of course, this is connected. Like I said, I don't see it as a surprise, but it's actually the way that the state functions also in terms of its fascist tendencies. So I think that even puts further the necessity to really work towards and push further and contribute to a radical global abolitionist, anti-war, anti-capitalist, anti-racial capitalist movement. And I think here again, thank you that you mentioned the statement of the Zapatistas, because I think a lot is coming from the ground, even also from Eastern European, Ukrainian, Russian communist comrades, socialist comrades. They have issued a lot of statements, right? To think like, we cannot stand with states here, and we cannot stand with Russia or with NATO, but we have to build a radical global abolitionist anti-war movement from below. And we've also seen it coming from comrades in South Africa who remind us of the non-aligned movement. It's not that we don't have an alternative, right? The Bandung Conference, this really, of course, needs to go from below and to say, we stand either with the West nor with Russia, so to speak, because we need a different kind of future. And we know also for every climate activist, this is our issue too. This massive militarization, we know that the military is one of the major polluters and destructors of this planet. So it's actually on all fronts very urgent.
Thank you. I'm gonna pass it over to Harsha.
Thank you all. What brilliant conversation, truly. I'm just so grateful for this space and so grateful to share space. And just again, to echo what folks have said already, you know, in terms of the consolidation of ultra-right nationalism, how important it is to view that through an internationalist and transnational lens so that we don't get stuck in these kind of campist ideas of like the West and Russian imperialism, right? That we're really thinking from below, that we're thinking in solidarity with people. And as Vanessa mentioned, you know, so many statements that are coming from Eastern European leftist organizations. And, you know, some of the ones that I've read that have been translated from Ukrainian left organizations and Russian dissident left organizations, who point out that, you know, how hypocritical the claim of denazification is for various reasons. One, of course, that, you know, both Ukraine and Russia and so many other parts of the world have, you know, are Nazified, are growing in intensity when it comes to their extra institutional Nazi organizations, by which we mean, you know, street-based Nazi formations, but also that war itself is actually entrenching and solidifying far-right nationalism, right? So it is very hypocritical to suggest that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is going to denazify because it's actually strengthening nationalist, far-right nationalist ideologies. And we're seeing that in some of the new viral videos that are coming out. how that's doing that. And so, the truth is that war and militarism, as Vanessa and Chelsea have pointed out, are actually intensifying far-right nationalism, and that really it transcends borders, right? That's happening in terms of both on the street, but also the institutionalization of violence and the ways in which militarism is exacerbating that. I think in terms of this question of the uneven accumulation of wealth, I did want to amplify one of the demands that I feel doesn't get as much attention, which is the demand that is coming out from the Ukraine, but also amplified by leftists elsewhere, which is the demand to cancel Ukraine's foreign debt. And I think this is so crucial because, in thinking about racial capitalism and thinking about imperialism, the ways in which the World Bank and IMF have structured the world was something that we thought more about years ago, in the kind of era of global justice, but it's kind of gone to the wayside. And so I wanted to amplify that because it's so connected to conversations around debt forgiveness, locally, and thinking about the way in which debt structures our lives completely, and also the ways in which debt is a tool of global imperialism, right? And consolidating unequal relations around the world. And, we know that that's what the IMF is, right? The International Monetary Fund it's a predatory loan shark at a global scale, like on steroids, that forces conditions of market liberalization, state austerity, and you're really using debt as a disciplinary mechanism to reorganize entire economies, right? And currently, there's more than 70 countries around the world, approximately 70 countries around the world, within what we know as the global South and the Eastern Bloc, who are subjected to the IMF, and Ukraine is one of them. And just 3 days ago, the Ukraine had to request emergency financing of $1.4 billion under the IMF's rapid financing instrument, which is being heard today, right? It's being adjudicated on or decided on today by the IMF. And so I think this demand to cancel Ukraine's debt in relationship to IMF loans and austerity conditions is a really central demand for the anti-war movement, in addition to thinking beyond nation states and calling for a genuine peace movement, as Vanessa highlighted. And the last thing that I wanted to offer in terms of thinking about what this means, or maybe two quick points in terms of what's unfolding. This may be, I don't know if this is unpopular opinion or this is like pessimism, but I think what we are going to see is the militarism of borders, right? Even as in this moment, we are witnessing this extraordinary so-called welcome, which we know is conditional. And as we know in 2015, how quickly that shifts. I think in the long term, what we're going to see is the continuing militarism militarization of Fortress Europe, which includes not only the militarization of Fortress Europe, but also the externalization of Europe's borders into the Sahel region, further south into Turkey and elsewhere. And so I think that's one thing that we are going to see in the long term that will stand in contrast to perhaps this exceptional moment, if we can call it that. So I think that's one thing that we're going to definitely see, and that amplifies what we're already seeing, right? The uneven distribution of who is being welcomed and under what conditions. So not to in any way suggest that welcome, as we've already discussed, is equally distributed, because the horror stories of what is happening to Africans in Ukraine, to Punjabis in Ukraine, to those who are multiply displaced in Ukraine, right? Refugees from Yemen, from Afghanistan. I think that's going to be amplified. And I think one of the pieces as well that I wanted to highlight that's connected to the border is, right now there's a lot of discussion about Ukraine in relationship to the EU and Ukraine in relationship to NATO. But in relationship to the border, one thing is that we don't often talk about in current conversations is how the EU actually has a border assistance mission in Moldova and Ukraine, right? Like, even as Ukraine is not part of the EU, the Ukraine is part of the EU BAM, which is a border assistance mission whose entire kind of mandate is basically to provide completely EU-based financing. It's all European Union money that is going to fortify that's going to fortify Ukrainian borders, right? So what we saw unfolding at the Ukrainian and Polish border and Belarus last year is a direct outcome in relationship to the EU's role in fortifying Ukraine's border and Moldova's border. And also at the same time, coming back to the first point, part of what this mission does is actually to integrate the Ukraine into a deep and comprehensive, as it's called, free trade agreement, right? So we see the synergy between the flow of capital and racial capitalism and border militarization. So I think that's also a connection to think about, and one that I think I might be wrong. What do I know, right? But that I think will be further entrenched in terms of in the coming years, really.
Appreciate that, Harsha, as always. Susie, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just keep it really short. But just piggybacking on what Vanessa and Harsha have said, but returning to the point about binaries and how dangerous, I guess, that can be. The other point about binaries is that there's a tendency right now to associate the West with democracy and the East with autocracy, as if those are inherently embedded kind of characteristics of each of those places. But as we all know, I mean, we've been talking about the kind of transnational effect or rise of the far right, that in other words, it's not contained by national borders by any means. And I don't think it's kind of it's not the monopoly of a particular geographic region to associate with one kind of political system as opposed to another. But I think the danger of doing so is reflected exactly in the kind of response that is being offered on the table to bring the conflict to some kind of a resolution. And the two main things that I'm thinking about here is the military kind of support or the weapons transfers into Ukraine currently by the NATO countries. And there is no assurance that that will stay in sort of in the kind of powers that you think will benefit that it would advance world peace in any way. So in other words, I'm suggesting that you know, as people have been talking about the rise of the far right, you know, who is to say that those weapons are not going to fall into the hands of the far right within Ukraine at some point in the future? And I think it's really just, it's not the demilitarized kind of solution that we've been talking about. And the other part that I wanted to also mention was that, you know, as those of us that have been following the news, basically all Ukrainian males between the ages of 18 and 60 are prohibited from actually leaving the country and are prohibited from conscientious objection to fighting. And so I think that's a serious problem in terms of offering even Ukrainians that are within the country from either fleeing or refusing to fight. I mean, imagine if both of the militaries in Russia and Ukraine basically refused to fight, regardless of what, let's say, Putin or, you know, Zelensky said. I mean, it's basically, you know, the pacifist way of ending conflict, and that's essentially been taken out of as an option for the adult males in Ukraine. And the other thing that I also wanted to mention briefly was just the imposing of sanctions. I think there's a tendency to assume that imposing sanctions would be the non-violent way to get the so-called enemy to succumb. But as we know, very oftentimes, sanctions basically affect the most vulnerable population. And I think we're beginning to already hear the economic impact within Russia. And there's very little, I've heard anyway, in the media about talking about concerns about how this will impact the everyday life of ordinary Russians, for example. So just wanted to mention, I guess, so the importance, again, just to underscore what Vanessa mentioned about the importance of demilitarized options. In other words, you know, real engagement towards diplomacy as an option, and really supporting the pacifists and the peace activists on the ground, whether it's in Russia or Ukraine.
Thank you so much for that, Susie and everyone. Such a vibrant and rich conversation. Just really grateful to be here with all of you. And thank you for everyone for your comments and questions. We'll shift to Q&A in a little bit. And again, I just want to reiterate what Dylan shared in the beginning. We're so sorry that we won't be able to respond to all questions, but we'll try to cluster questions as much as possible. So I just want to transition into another question that we offered to our panelists, and maybe we can start with SA. So the question is, how does this current crisis in this particular border region, and border region is in quotations here, reflect how borders are all over the planet, are sites of state violence, anti-Black containment, reactionary and far-right mobilization, migrant and refugee policing, sexual and gender violence, and other forms of differentiated hierarchical exposure to suffering and death. So Ase, I want to hand it to you.
Sorry, thank you, Crystal. All of my thoughts are at this moment so jumbled. I want to thank, in particular, Vanessa, Harsha, everyone, Kenan, in particular, for offering us this kind of constellation. I want to be brief, so I'm going to try to connect my thoughts and not ramble. I want to reiterate just very quickly, that I'm glad that border region was in inverted commas, was in quotes, because that is, in fact, the crisis in question. I also just want to take a liberty of making like a meta thing, and just because I'm also seeing the chat and I've been in the world and had conversations. I also just want to name that not everyone in this space is just an academic, and it's actually really useful to mobilize what Stuart Hall talked to us about, which is identifications over identities, which is to say that some of us might work in a certain place and collect a paycheck, and that has implications that we need to attend to, but are also people in the world doing our versions of the work. And so I do want to name that in a way to also say, because it might be a little academic, that but it's not an academic, small a matter, which is to say, what I would say, even in this moment, even as dilettante as it might sound, is to read. And that doesn't mean like take a theory book or take a seminar. It doesn't mean, to be an academic in an ivory tower, but actually that's how I came up in spaces in migrant and detention, anti-detention carceral groups throughout Europe and, Turtle Island, New York, Los Angeles, even in Berlin, which is how I got to meet Vanessa, who's also a comrade in a lot of ways and a scholar, right? So it's really actually important that we get clear, right? It's important that we understand when we're talking about things like non-alignment, we know what that means and we can attend to its histories. It's important that we're thinking about the life-offering gift that is, for example, Black study or Black studies, that we are not just like thinking about who to cite and overwhelmingly having them be Anglophone, Western, Euro-oriented or based people, but rather to say if anti-Blackness is indeed the part of the crisis and the bedrock of modernity, which is to say, the thing that we know thanks to and endemic through Europe as modernity, which consolidated racial ordering via racial capitalism, has now given us a contemporary moment in which the things that circulate border-free are crisis, is capital, is climate catastrophe, and white supremacy, which doesn't also need specifically white people to consolidate around it, which looks like militarism, which is again the border, right? These things circulate in a way that I just thank you for allowing me this liberty, although y'all are on mute, so I don't really get a say, but it's really important, I think, in this moment, because it's not, when I talk about the whataboutism, and I'm going to get very briefly to touch on binaries, we sort of say like, well, this is the real world or things are happening really right now. And this is not a game and it is not a joke, right? It is important that we think seriously, especially in moments like this. It is important that we think against the alignment and white supremacist consolidation of what we name and think we know as crisis, what we name and think we know as emergence and emergency, to say, actually, perhaps for our survival, we can actually invest and have a deeper awareness of what solidarity, and I mean solidarność, actually and really means, what it looks like to embody the principles of alignment to otherwise causes that don't look like, in this case, NATO or Russia's imperial forces, but some otherwise kind of structures of alignment. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel because we've actually been here before. I just wanted to name this. I also did want to just throw in here, while we're talking about Europe, we're talking about Eastern Europe, we're talking about the West, and I also just wanted to put on the table, this is just for people, like take home to think through that, which is, I think, Harsha, Sunny, others have mentioned, the thing that we're naming as Europe is itself a global product on top of the bedrock of anti-Blackness. There are other kinds of asymmetries in terms of North, East, West, South, right? The Europes that are happening, but I want to also hold that may not matter, for example, to someone in Haiti, right? Or to, right, like there's not someone in DR who is necessarily attending to the fact that Northern Europeans treat Southern Europeans like Southern Europeans treat Africans, right? So when we think about non-alignment and we think, like Harsha mentioned, internationalism, when we return to a Black international or internationalism more broadly that we can actually live capaciously within, this would allow us to think about these intricacies. This would allow us to have really open conversations that don't just get to phenotype and retrench us into the same global order that we're actually collectively meant to be combating on the so-called left, right? That we can actually attend to diversities and differences and asymmetries in these broader contexts, but also not, and this is, by the way, for the whataboutism question, right? And not shy away, though, from the fact that certain things can loom large in our imaginaries, right? So it's to do that, but not then say, now we don't care, because Ukraine issues are actually Haitian issues. And Harsha gave us one very key example, which is to say the IMF, right? It is to say that when France is making these calls and demands to Russia, then an internationalist model is like, well, what about you, France? What about the Congo? What about Haiti? What about repairing the debt and other kinds of reparations that are owed to these various communities? The very last thing that I did just want to say, I don't even know anymore if this is about the question that was asked, but when we're talking about the border region, and then when we have Susie talking to us about, Ukrainian males, I really appreciate that because it helps me circle back to an earlier point that I didn't really get to. When we have Kanan talking to us quite seriously about what's happening on the ground, and for centuries and at least generations in the most recent moment, to Roma people, and other minoritarian ethnic groups and people, right? We also know for a fact that when I talk about modernity, when we're talking about this iteration of crisis, borders don't just look geographic. We've already, again, said they involve capital, they involve ideology like white supremacy and the borderlessness and creeping fascisms that are increasingly global phenomena, but also gender is itself a border, right? And so when you have people that are so-called Ukrainian males, these are like one specific moment where you have, for example, trans women in the Ukraine who are not able to cross the border because their documents say M on it, and that puts them into a particular dynamic where they have to, they're prevented from fleeing for their lives, but they're also being conscripted into a military war that will impact their bodies because we are not in a gender liberatory state, right? So already we're dealing with the sort of mapping of the border onto one's body through gender and its kinds of alignment through whiteness and white supremacy, which again don't require white people necessarily, or, I don't want us to lose sight of the conversation we're really having when we say, white people there, or it's white supremacy. We're not actually necessarily just speaking about people who have phenotypically pale skin or otherwise, right? It's these perceptions of how these geographies map onto our personhood. And so it does matter, right? Not just to say, well, what do the Ukrainians have to say about something, as though that is a kind of authorizing move and mode, because we do have, the Ukrainian nation state today in the UK saying that we need, of course, to segregate the lines, and there's only issues about Africans and South Asians at the border because they're perceived to be getting things that Ukrainians are not getting, when that global perception and world order is actually the problem at hand. That, just to sort of put it all together, that attending to Black study, attending to internationalism and the Black international will actually keep our eye on the prize and acknowledge when the call is coming from inside the house, so that we don't need to be conscripted ourselves into this ideological warfare that is actually not in our collective best interest, and actually are speeding up the facilitation of the death-making project of white supremacy that we claim to perhaps pontificate about or watch CNN about into the wee hours, as though that is informing us in the real struggle at hand.
Thank you. I want to express appreciation for that for that comment, essay. And I'll just say that as I thought about trying to convene everybody, you know, again, working closely with Crystal and essay, I mean, I thought a lot about how the long work of the movements that I try to put myself in community with, you know, including diasporic abolitionist praxis as part of Black revolutionary and Black radical praxis, you know, global anti-colonial praxis, that these forms of collective work and creativity, they've always devoted primary energy to extended, serious analysis and theorization of the conditions of struggle. That's never been understood as some kind of academic exercise reserved for professional intellectual. It's never been understood that way. Any just modest, casual understanding of those histories of abolition and anti-colonialism immediately demonstrates that. So I reject the compartmentalization of what some of our, you know, comrades here might otherwise compress as so-called academic discourse. I reject that. At the same time, I challenge the kind of privileging of academics at the very same time. So I think it's really important to pay attention to that, to think about how that analysis and theorization is about the conditions of struggle and also about how to struggle. You know, how to struggle, how to do work. There's not one way, most likely, in a particular moment, but there's probably a necessity to challenge simplistic understandings of things like solidarity, right? Concepts like solidarity, concepts like coalition, even concepts like community, right? What does it mean to perhaps unintentionally feed into a certain kind of ethnic or nationalist chauvinism in moments like this, right? That insists on a primacy of, you know, the position of the Ukrainian, given what you all have said, that kind of challenges, you know, the way many forces have come to understand what it means to be a Ukrainian. So I appreciate that. And with that, I'd like to maybe transition us into just a small cross-section, again, a fraction of the questions that people here have raised in the Q&A and in the chat. I'll move to a point that a number of people have raised in chat, but which Farah Muyadeen, I'm sorry if I mispronounced her name, posted, you know, earlier on, right around the time, you know, about half an hour in, which is, you know, a somewhat simple question, but I think it's a dense one that I'd love for as many folks on this roundtable to respond to as they can, which is, what reliable resources can you offer people who want to support folks in the Ukraine, including so-called people of color, you know, racialized peoples, and so forth, to help them with mutual aid, with safety and refuge. And I'd love if everybody could chime in on that. But I think was it Chelsea that was going to go first on that?
No, it was Sunny.
My bad, Sunny. Sorry about that. I lost track. Go ahead, Sunny. Uh-oh, Sunny's frozen. Okay, let me move to somebody else. Are there other folks that can offer direct resources for our audience, for our attendees who would like to kind of engage in direct aid, direct solidarity, those types of things? Sunny, I got you to respond to this question about resources if you're back.
I am back, but my connection just keeps going in and out. So one thing that I wanted to make sure that I addressed and I spoke to while I was on this panel was that we are indeed, you know, talking about not just Ukraine, obviously, but in a very broad understanding of how the different forces of what are happening and what is happening in Ukraine right now can be applied much more broadly. But I really would like to use this space and this platform to draw attention to what is also happening in the Balkans at this current moment. And I saw someone raise this in the chat, and so I feel like it needs to be responded to. So simultaneously, while what is happening in Ukraine is obviously a war, there is very much an alignment of
folks, if we lost Sunny, then I'm okay. If we lost Sunny, Sunny's back. Sunny, you were just talking about in the Balkans about an alignment.
And I think my connection just keeps going out, so I'll try to keep it brief.
That's okay.
Yeah, I'll probably go out in a couple minutes, but really challenge everyone that has an interest, that raised this in the chat, to pay attention to what is going on in the Balkans and look at the different alignment of nationalist forces that are happening there. Very practically speaking, look at Republika Srpska, look at what is happening in terms of, someone talked about non-alignment. Think about the positioning that's coming together, where through various alignments that are coming as a result of sort of this new coming together of non-alignment countries, Kosovo, some countries are no longer recognizing the independence of Kosovo because of coming together. I also would really challenge you to look at the, to follow people and to follow the work of people who are writing on this, who are saying, please pay attention to the Balkans. And that would be Una Hajdari, it would be Alexander Brezar, and it would be Mujanovic. Listen to their work, listen to what they're saying, pay attention to what they're saying, because as we are talking and as we are talking about the work that needs to be done, there are other, let's say, crises. We're using this idea of crises. There are other crises that perhaps Montenegro is the other question that came, the other issue that came up in the chat. Let's look at what is happening. Let's look at this idea of Ruski Mir, but also this idea of a greater Serbia, and where Serbs, this idea that Serbia is wherever Serbs are. And let's pay attention to that, because what is happening in Ukraine has a much larger context, even within Europe. And I will type the names in the chat before my connection goes out again. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate you, son. Kenan, I know that you have some resources you'd like to share, so let me go to you.
Okay, I will just want to add something to Sunny, because she mentioned Serbia, and this, it's very important people to understand that also what happened now to Russia, with sanction and stuff like this. Yes, I think the majority think this is a good thing. We can bring Putin down and stuff like this. But sorry, I come from this country where I grow up with sanction. And I grew up in war for 10 years. My crazy years was on in wartime. So I actually come from Croatia, then in Kosovo and Serbia. So I have a little bit experience about the sanction. And in this time was also Milosevic, don't forget. And he was richer and richer in the time of sanction, because the big people, they always find a way how to sell the goods and to bring other stuff. I don't think if McDonald's makes sanction, or Rolex, or I don't know which kind of firm gonna bring something for this, it's symbolic, yes. But for the people, no, you must also know a little bit this area. I mean, if you go in Moscow, okay, yes, you go Las Vegas, Moscow, no problem. But Russian is big. These people live for years in bad situation. That you must imagine how they live for all of this year in time of Stalin and after, and big SSSR, I don't know what, but with this sanction, we're gonna these people are gonna suffer so more. So the politician not, but the people more. So I don't know, is this good or not? And this is not the way to bring him, because we also didn't push away Milosevic because of sanction. No, it was because of bombing. 78 days, NATO alliance, Washington, and all of the Europe bombing us for 78 days. So, and today they didn't say sorry, because they kill also innocent people. It was not just a military bases and stuff like this. No, my also town go burn from the bombs. Also a lot of other structure what we use like people. So so the war is also a basin of life. So this is something what we not must to forget. Yes. So of course, I don't know about the research. You mean the information about because I was a little bit. Dylan, if you just can ask me again about what it was about the research.
Yes, I was about to ask you if you could offer people some kind of links they can directly support your work at the network, Roma Anti-Discrimination Network, which, yes, I've been studying it since I was introduced to your work.
Okay, I just have something of English. We have a lot of German, but we also translate one in English. You can see here. This is also something like one appel, I don't know if it's right English, to stop segregation for the refugees from Ukraine, so equal rights and health for everybody. But of course, it's more. I don't know how your connection to Europe is, but I can send maybe later to Vanessa her email or something like this. I have just this now. And of course, the media, you have a lot about this, but to find something about the Roma or Black communities or others, they face discrimination. It's very, very little in the big media. So this is also one problem. We just have resources from the people. They have this kind of experience of discrimination, or some small organization, they speak about it. But in big media, they don't speak. And this is our problem now, because I don't know how to make this known, that people know what's happening.
Thank you, Kenan. This is, I think, why Farah's question was so important. Is so many of the kind of dominant ways.
Two more. I will
please.
Two more. Also
yes.
from Slovakia, Czechia. So they have also something.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. And I appreciate folks raising that question. Go ahead, Vanessa.
Kenan, du kannst auch in den Chat einfach kopieren. Ich habe Roma in Tschechien schon reingemacht, die Seite. I just told Kenan that Kenan could also just copy the link and put it here, at least from the sites. And I already put for the Roma network in Czechia, so you can also read there. They have like covered a lot in terms of what is currently going on. Just in terms of some resources, because obviously there's a language issue too, right? It's different to find everything in English. And I think there was also one question in terms of, well, what should people do now? And particularly for folks that are like threatened, their lives are threatened by that war. And I think, so Analyse und Kritik, for those of you who speak German, I will definitely look out for it if they've published it in English. They did the work of translating several calls and several statements of Ukrainian as well as Russian leftist organization, and they don't call for further bombing. So there are alternatives. As abolitionists, we know that. And I think it's very crucial, right? We have these issues all the time with police, for instance, or with these kind of conversation, that alternatives, particularly with the radical movements on the ground, are being called for. And I think that's what needs to be supported. Like, we don't support states, but support poor people. Like we know from Rosa Luxemburg, actually, when the rich wages war, the poor die. So that's what we have to counter. And I think Rosa Luxemburg, I think it's crucial to get back to her work here in terms of what we study currently too. But in terms of like what is going on locally or some of the resources people could look at, I want to highlight Isidora Rangelovic from the Roma community in Germany, who has written a lot, some stuff also in English, and the network she's actually engaging with Romani Pen, who are also doing important work in terms of, I don't know, policing in Europe or whatever. You have a new book that's also in English by Adam Elliott Cooper. Eddie Bruce Jones has worked on this. And several others. SA obviously works on the Black Mediterranean, because I think it's also crucial. It was said before that we also look there. And I think that's when it comes to what's currently happening in Ukraine, and we said it before, we cannot disconnect it from what's also going on in Somalia, what's also going on in Ethiopia. And it's not whataboutism, right? To really stick to the necessity of appreciating and embracing all lives, where life is precious, like we know from our comrade Ruth Wilson Gilmore. So and some of the maybe other resources, particularly in terms of groups that are doing work, because groups are doing tremendous work. Like, I've been following some of the networks, having some phone call, trying to support from here, even from like a transnational dimension. People are organizing in the so-called red zones, the hot war zones, coordinating drivers to get people. They just got the students out of Sumy, right? And so and there are several networks actually that concentrate on multi-marginalized groups. One of that network in Poland is Grupa Garnica, that's definitely to be supported. Medico International works with them. In Germany, you have several Black movements. A whole network was now brought together with 30 Black organizations, the Tubman Network, that is mainly taking care of accommodation and also medical supplies. EOTO is a hub in Berlin because we need to also, even so many cities are now really on their limits in terms of like really doing the work, because not everybody is welcomed like the perceived white Ukrainian, although they're already suffering, but a lot of people have severe issues now going on in terms of what's the asylum status. They don't know where to sleep. There's no shelter, medical supply. So EOTO is doing great work in Berlin. They also pair with the Black community Hamburg. There's Casa Kua, a queer of color network that is actually now really working around medical support, Oya, and various other organizations. I think it's, and SafeBow. SafeBow is an organization that is really transnational, where folks from all kinds of contexts are actually giving their resources, like just logistically helping to collect information, to update these informations, etc. And I think it's really important to engage with these kind of local groups and organizations, because they're often left out, right? When we have major flows of donations coming in. And a lot of these large organizations, they actually exclude, like Kenan said already, Roma people, multi-marginalized people, etc. So I will put some of the groups also in the links, because I think this went quite fast. Thanks.
I appreciate the resource sharing. I know that's the demand folks are making. So let's just keep doing this. And I know Essay and then Susie have some stuff they want to share.
Yes, I will this time be very brief. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Of course, there are networks, including the folks at Watson Med the Alarm, Arco Migratorio, and other sort of networks that are have learned to do what we have to do on the ground, which is adapt quickly, and so move from the Mediterranean Sea to think about the top of Italy, which actually does have its own history of irredentism, and the word irredentism is an Italian one, but maybe we save this for another day. But so on the border where there's Trieste, in Slovenia, Austria, and other places, there are sort of burgeoning migrant support groups that did not know there were migrant support groups, because they were responding to economic issues and sort of other things. And so that's actually where I want to leave my brief remark in terms of resources, which is to say that there were about 250 people on this call at some point. If parts of it get circulated, they circulate, but we are also resources. And to be in good relation, we can be resources to one another. So this means, opening up your purse and have sharing money if you have that, or if you're in context where you can make those decisions. But also, we also have to start from somewhere. So I know that I said the thing about Black study, and it is for me a primary place of survival, right? And you have to get in where you fit in and learn something. And so if there's something where you're looking to do something, maybe you look instead to your neighbor and your relative in your own local context, and then you say, well, what do we do? Well, what do we know? And then you get informed together and you try to make interventions, because the organizations that I'm seeing are people who, if they weren't already in LSG Migra, or like working already for anti-border, anti-carceral, pro-asylum seeker, and these kinds of projects. They were working for things like Ni Una Di Meno, which is a women's support network, women broadly, capaciously considered, where they are thinking about broader concerns of the patriarchy and, people who are impacted by things like war, and war also including like climate catastrophe, which is an iteration of warfare, which includes sort of the broad-based gender violence. And so I just encourage people to think about where they can plug into their communities already doing versions of the work, and then to think about how to sustain that project internationally.
Thank you. I got Susie, and then we're going to transition to begin to close this session out. Stay on, everybody.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I mentioned earlier, I mentioned the Ukrainian pacifist movement. So I just wanted to share, I'm going to drop a link in the chat with everybody on the call to the statement issued by the Ukrainian pacifist movement earlier. And then also I wanted to, there's in the Q&A, I think Vanessa also mentioned this earlier, but I think, and it's not just limited to this one question, because it really reflects the overwhelming kind of, I guess, this, in some ways, the cynicism that we've all kind of fallen into, that, you know, if Russia, if Putin is, you know, raining down bombs on Ukraine, what resource or what recourse is there except to fight back militarily? And I just wanted to share thoughts from, you know, grassroots movements, movements for peace that have been around for a long time. The second link that I'm dropping is from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is the oldest women's peace organization. It was formed basically during World War I, alarmed at the fact that there was that conflict back then. And it lays out a very detailed plan about what can we actually do? What can we call on leaders to do? What can we call on the United Nations to do that would de-escalate and demilitarize, as opposed to a militarized solution? So I just wanted to share those links with folks. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. As we transition to closing comments, I wanted to, again, you know, apologize to everybody here that we ran out of time to get at any significant number. We just got to really just one major question, which was resources. So what our plan is, as we were thinking through this in a dynamic and live way, is once we edit and decide to publish this video, we'll collectively make a decision on that. If we do publish this video, I think we're going to curate the questions that you all have raised in the Q&A and in the chat, and actually include them and publish them alongside the video, to sustain the spirit and the substance of what we named as collective study at the beginning and throughout this session. So again, I hope that this is not taken as some kind of definitive conversation, but rather as a catalyzing point of departure for all of us to continue our discussions. Crystal, why don't you close this out, or begin to close this out?
Well, thank you everyone so much for this really generous, generative, critical conversation. I'm just reminded of moments like this. It's just so necessary to be able to create time and space to be with one another. So I want to actually make sure that all of our panelists here have a minute or two if you want to just offer some last comments as we close out. But again, this just to also reiterate with what Dylan's said, that this is really just the beginning of this conversation. I know that we are already having multiple conversations in our own spaces with one another. So perhaps we can start with Harsha in terms of just closing comments.
Sorry, do you mind coming back to me? I was just typing some links in the chat.
Sorry. Sure, no worries. Maybe Chelsea.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be brief too. I know we don't have much time. I just want to extend a thank you again to my brilliant panelists that I've been able to join you all today, and for our facilitators, for Dylan and Crystal, and just this opportunity to be able to dialogue with you all. And thank you to all our attendees. And I was trying to follow as many questions as I could in the chat and the Q&A, and just thank you for your insightful commentary and thoughts. And, you know, I was thinking about a couple of the questions in particular, because there were some questions about, well, what to do in this moment, right? What the urgency of the matter. And some people in a way, of a more critical way, we're just trying to figure out, why are we having this conversation? And I think I want to address that first, because this conversation is also very critical. It's very urgent, and it's necessary to both situate what's going on in a broader context, right? That's one of the goals of this conversation, as was discussed in the invitation itself, but also to shine a particular light on the experiences of those minoritized and racialized groups experiencing various forms of racism in various borders in various ways. And so that actually is very key for this conversation, because another question was about what to do in this moment. And part of it too is just a radical rethinking and a radical love and coalition building in terms of who's included. So a lot of what we're talking about are various forms of exclusion and marginalization. And so one of the ways to respond is to really think about who is not included, who is being excluded in multiple ways. And so while that might not feel, as concrete, there are ways to put that into action. And a lot of that happens with supporting groups and resources that were listed in the chat, but also just rethinking, a re-envisioning a different understanding, and really just shining a light on these issues that often are not talked about. I've attended so many panels lately about this conversation, and very rarely have these topics even been addressed. And so that's one thing I wanted to say. And then another point too that someone made was about surviving war in this moment. And I and to speak to that as somebody who's not had to experience what's going on the ground in Ukraine. I don't have that experience. And I, was reading reports about the hospital that was bombed. I say this morning, but I'm not sure actually where on the timeline, it was either yesterday evening or this morning in Ukraine. But I do know that building and forming solidarity across multiple war zones is something that also is really key in terms of surviving in this moment. And I was reminded of connections and conversations between Ferguson in Missouri and Palestine, and what those look like, and what those really did in terms of collaboration, and again, that radical love and care. And so just wanted to put that out there as well, that these aren't just symbolic discussions, but these are actually on the ground, live, real time ways of thinking about care in this particular moment. And again, just thank you all for allowing me to be able to participate in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. So I'm aware of time right now, so I want to give all of our panelists opportunity to close out, if possible, to keep your comments brief. I'm so sorry about that. Again, it's just because of time. So maybe I will transition to Vanessa and then Harsha.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just keep it short. I'm very honored and humbled to be in conversation with you, and let's continue to do the work wherever we are. And I think it needs a new, stronger, we can call it global movement or even internationalism. Obviously, a lot of particularly migrant and refugee groups are already doing the work. They're actually crossing a lot of the kind of borders and I don't know, forms of genocidal violence, the articulations of racial capitalism and its connectedness to militarism, and also, of course, heteropatriarchy are doing that already. And I think what we can just is to continue to work and strengthen the work. And I think we need to constantly struggle against this methodological nationalism. That's something that we also saw in terms of the rebellions 2020, Black Lives Matter, that it was tough to even give it, turn it to not just being focused on North America. I think what a lot of our comrades in Eastern Europe, as not a homogeneous entity, but of these various places, also the continent, so-called various forms, various places of the global South are urging us to do is to leave the West. And I think with a Fanonian note, to leave Europe in what it really means and how it has spread the world is the way to move forward, but really in a global sense to counter every form of nationalism. So maybe then it's not the question of belonging to a nation or in a nation, but actually how to abolish the nation and all of its configurations.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Harsha, can you give it back to you?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, just so grateful again to everybody. I've learned so much, and I'm deeply grateful for the space and this convening. And I'm thinking on really what everyone's saying and just how important it is, especially in this time, to think expansively, right? Because it can become, and Essay, you spoke to this, Vanessa, Chelsea, everyone has spoken to this, Sunny and Susie, about how it can become, in moments of crisis, as defined currently, it can become easy to say, oh, thinking expansively is somehow an affront to people who are struggling on the ground, as if though that isn't part of the struggle, right? So I just wanted to emphasize that, because otherwise, we don't see the continuities of violence that is so necessary for us to see in order to prevent crises to continue to metastasize and manifest. And if we are to understand what's happening at the border, maybe one thing that I want us to think about, and really thinking about, Essay, your last sets of comments about how important it is to engage with Black studies in particular, if we understand the policing of migration as so fundamentally constituted through anti-Blackness, right? That if we are thinking about Black liberation is to think about the abolition of borders, and to think about the abolition of borders is to think alongside Black liberation struggles. How important that is in this moment, not only because of the ways in which we are seeing the disproportionate impact of Black people in Ukraine trying to flee, but specifically because the border is anti-Black, right? So it's not just about disproportionate impact, it's about the structure itself being fundamentally anti-Black in terms of the regulation and policing of Black freedom and Black movement, and how necessary that is. And of course, Esther, your works around the Black Mediterranean as being so crucially necessary now and always, and the work of everyone. And I think that's just so, I want to amplify that, given some of the comments that are suggesting that this is kind of a side issue, that no, it's really central. It's central to how we even understand the concept of Europe, right? Like Europe is fundamentally underwritten by anti-Blackness, is fundamentally written through Islamophobia. What even is the boundary between Europe and Africa and Asia and Central Asia is so constituted through these histories that continue in the present. And so I just want to express my gratitude for this expansive thinking that's being offered here by the panelists that allows us to think in this ways, that's allowing us to think around racialization in solidarity with Roma peoples, in solidarity with Black peoples on the move, in solidarity with migrants on the moves who pledge no allegiance to the nation state necessarily, right? Who are multiply displaced. And so really the abolition of the border and the abolition of the nation state as part of what freedom and what this crisis needs to orient us towards, rather than a reinscription of a really dangerous nationalism.
Harsha, thank you so much, really just amplifying everything that you just shared. Susie?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that I'm just really grateful for this conversation. I think I probably learned way more than I was able to contribute. But just wanted to also, I guess in closing out, you know, there's a lot of, there are a lot of comments that, oh, I guess the Cold War never ended because now there's this conflict again between the East and West, and it's not just limited to, you know, Russia versus the US, but also there's the whole issue of China versus the US as well. And but I guess I just wanted to say that, you know, if you think back to the transnational peace movement, they actually played a really important role in sort of, you know, de-escalating the Cold War throughout the 1980s. And I just wanted to emphasize and underscore again the importance of the transnational solidarity movement in this moment to make sure that, you know, we find a demilitarized solution as opposed to a militarized one.
Thank you so much, Susie, for that. Kenan, I just want to give it to you for closing comments.
Yeah. Yeah, first of all, thank you for this event and this meeting, and all this topic is very, very helpful. I appreciate also to be also here and to speak about these issues, and also about the Roma is so not so much to transnational to hear about this. So I hope we can use somehow this new way. I don't know, we have so many possibilities now also to hear our voices. I will be glad if we do something here in Europe, so to bring the message in the other part of the world, you know. What I don't have now is, you know, like we have Zapatista in Göttingen, in Germany, in Spain, you know, this year. It was beautiful, you know, it was Corona, but they arrived, we welcomed them, and it was very, very nice. They just want to hear us, what we do, and then how we move, and how are our structure, what is our problem. So we hear also from them. I know them from 90s, Rage Against the Machine, and all of this was in my head, but I'd never see them, yes. And then they come. This is something that they bring some energy, yes. So I think this is what I miss. Somehow we are too much local, or maybe also national, but more local, and we have a lot of organization, a lot of names, but we need somehow the unity. I know unity is something like utopia, it's not working, I don't know what. Yes, we know all of this, but we must have somehow to recognize ourselves that we work together. even we have different thoughts and methods, issues, but to have something, I just gonna say the extremists, they are very international connected. You know, they are very international collected. They go around and do the stuff. I don't promote them now, but it's very important for us to make some kind of. I hope after this Corona or stuff like this, we can start. We have also here now planned for this year some big conference, but something like 300 people for the beginning. We see how we're going to have the law in Germany. But of course, we would like to welcome you, and even in this kind of art of to know each other or other organization, what you have and stuff like this, just to show the solidarity. And one thing more, please don't, I don't know, I just don't like to come in the whole, you know, like what the media and this politics. This war is something what behind the walls they signed a lot of different projects what the normal people don't know, like Vanessa say, you know, like 100 billions euro for the weapon, you know, they use the emotion of people to create something what they want, you know, I don't know, the capitalists or who, but it's the fact, is the reality. So it's okay to go in demo against Russia, but I don't know, somehow we must also think our thing to not let the stuff go, you know, like this is gonna change the world, so we need to do something. Okay, and thank you very much, and I hope I see you again.
No, thank you so much just for the critical solidarity work and on the ground work that you're doing and for joining us today. So I want to give it to Sunny and then Essay.
I'll be very brief because I'm very aware of the time. I just wanted to say thank you so much for organizing this panel. Thank you. It was wonderful to be in dialogue with all of you. I hope that we continue. A lot of the conversation that has been going on in my communities more very broadly is why should we care about this war? And I think that through this dialogue, through this conversation, hopefully conversations like this that will continue, we will help people who feel themselves outside of this conflict, who feel that they're not connected in some kind of way, see why they should care, see why they should get involved, and learn more about resources that are out there. And hopefully we can be the ones that are also producing resources to help people to understand why they should care about this war.
Thank you so much, Sunny and Essay.
Yeah, I think what we know from Robin D.G. Kelly, Angela Davis, and many others, their freedom is a constant struggle. And I think that my one closing comment is that we consider who we are and what we means and think about what it means to enact solidarity. I did mention 2 Black American people, but to mention just one last one, there's a chorus of a Jill Scott song that says, maybe we should just be silent. One of my favorite songs. And I do want to also name that the media, as people were talking about getting things from the media, where do we turn? Sometimes the Western media, specifically the North American, United States media, exporting mis and disinformation, maybe we, including even though we just had this 2-hour panel, could also think about what it means for us to lay down certain forms of iterative extant communication and actually think about what it means to listen to the needs of the global communities that we want to be a part of.